The cold October air filled my lungs as I brushed past the bushes to either side. I grunted when a twig I had just pushed aside snapped back and whipped me in the face. "Wait!" Dylan called out to me from behind, and I halted to give him and the others some time to catch up with me. "Way to leave us hanging back there," he commented upon arriving at my side. Jack followed close behind, panting a little, and at last Emily joined us as well. I looked around at each of their faces, each one having grown familiar and dear to me in the past 20 years the four of us had known each other. I could still remember what they used to look like as children, but the older we had gotten, the further we had grown apart. Time had separated us. Well, maybe not all of us. I smiled at Jack as he shuffled closer to me and reached out to grab my hand. As our fingers intertwined, the well-known feeling of his ring against my skin reminded me of our engagement. Dating someone you have known all your life is weird. I always had a feeling he saw me as more than just a friend, but I never wanted to take any risks of destroying an emotional bond. And then one day, Jack came to my place unannounced to profess his undying love for me or something. The poor guy was completely hammered. I told him that he could stay the night and we would talk things out the following day. I could hardly deny that I had started developing feelings for him at that point. So we finally decided we would give it a shot and start testing the waters. Our testing the waters soon developed into a pretty serious relationship, and then about 5 months ago, Jack proposed to me after having dated for several years. We're going to get married in 8 months, the prospect of which made my heart flutter with joy. Even in that remote forest the four of us had gotten together to go camping in. Dylan raised an eyebrow at us and made some snide remark about saving some of the cuddling for our honeymoon. A statement that made both of us roll our eyes. Emily laughed at Dylan and told him he was just jealous because his relationship wasn't making any progress, and he didn't have the balls to pop the question. We joked around and playfully mocked each other before proceeding into the woods on the lookout for a place to set up camp. When we finally found a nice little clearing, we unpacked our stuff, and while the guys set up the tent, Emily and I went to gather some twigs and dry leaves we would use to make a campfire. We threw it all on a big heap, placed stones around it, and lit it on a fire, just like we had done so many times before. "Hey, you girls got the fire ready. I'm hungry," my fiance's voice sounded from behind the tent. "You guys got the tent up yet? We can have a stack as soon as you're done," I replied. Yeah, that's gonna take a little longer, I think," Jack responded. "Dylan ain't too much of a help neither." "Oh, shut up," I could hear Dylan say. "Just do it yourself next time if you're so dang smart." Jack grunted and Emily and I exchanged knowing glances. They had always been like this, poking fun at each other at every possible opportunity. Emily and I sat down by the fire to chat a little while the boys were busy with the tent. After about half an hour, my fiance called out to us in a cheerful manner. "Hey, come on over, it's ready." It was the same tent we had always used, a large one with 3 cabins and a large entry space where one of us, usually Jack, would always have to volunteer to sleep so the rest of us could be comfortable. "Thank God I don't need to sleep on the ground anymore," he remarked as if he had read my mind. "So dang cold." He grinned at me before adding, "Remember the moment you said yes, you signed up for me getting on your nerves for the rest of your life? It's gonna get hella comfy in there with 2 people squeezed into one room." "Ooh," Emily cooed. "Don't worry. By that he means he'll just take up all the space and force me to sleep in the tiniest of corners, while snoring loud enough to keep away all the wildlife in a 10-mile radius," I explained matter-of-factly, causing Dylan and Emily to laugh out loud while Jack gave a playfully insulted snortle. We all sat down by the campfire and began roasting our food while talking some more. Emily regaled us with stories about her life with her husband, and Dylan kept boasting about the promotion he got at his job. He had taken up the role of the quiet listener, while Jack prattled away about our wedding, the location we had chosen, the suit that he was going to wear, the guest list. I shot him a quick look reminding him not to give away the fact that we were planning on asking Emily and Dylan to be the maid of honor and best man respectively. I wanted to do that somewhere a little more formal. By the time the sun had set, we were still sat around our fireplace. Dylan had just handed out our third round of beer, and Emily, who had gotten quite cheerful over the evening, suddenly suggested we play a game of truth or dare. Dylan agreed enthusiastically. Jack seemed a bit reluctant at first but nodded, and I simply shrugged. Why not? Okay, I'll go first. Emily began. Clover, truth or dare? She looked at me expectantly. Dare, I replied. Alright, climb that tree over there. Oh, okay, lame but okay. I stood up and I walked towards the tree Emily was pointing at. I reached out for the lowest branch, pulled myself up and grabbed onto the one right above it. When I was high enough up, I swung my legs onto the first branch and slowly lowered my whole body down on it. Feeling a rush of adrenaline when I heard the wood creak under my weight, I looked up at Emily triumphantly. There you go. My turn. Dylan. Truth, he replied instantly. Are you actually going to ask Jill to marry you? Well, that got serious fast. But yeah, I do want to ask her, but I want to wait until the time is right. I don't want anyone else, but I do want it to be special. Like when she's least expecting it. When she's least expecting it, eh? My fiance chimed in. I can already see you knocking on the bathroom door while the poor girl's on the toilet. Yeah, sure, I'll marry you, sugar. Let me just pull my pants up. Emily jeered, mimicking the high-pitched voice of Dylan's girlfriend. Funny, guys, very funny. Say, Jack, how long do you have to keep Clover in your basement before Stockholm Syndrome sets in? Dylan asked with a sly grin. Jack grunted and I pretended to swing at him. Suddenly, the smile faded from Emily's face. Did you guys hear that? She asked. Hear what? I replied. I heard a branch snap, she said, turning to look around. Yeah, well, we're in the woods, so... It sounded like somebody stepped on it, though. She interrupted me. How do you know that? Dylan inquired. Will you shut up already? It just didn't sound right, okay? Quiet, Emily hissed. The four of us held our breaths. This time, we all heard it. The sound of footsteps echoed through the forest. Emily was right. Something about it sounded wrong. It was as if the forest had suddenly fallen completely silent, and there was no one but us and who or whatever had caused the noise. We exchanged concerned glances and I quietly slid off my branch and crept over to my fiancé. Dylan gestured for us to stay still. Finally, he slowly rose to his feet and, barely able to hide the nervousness in his voice, he called out, Is anybody there? Silence. The footsteps had stopped. This is freaking me out, I heard Emily whisper. Hello? Dylan called out once again. This time, however, a voice answered from among the trees. Good evening. I didn't mean to startle you. The four of us spun around to see a man standing right next to the tree that I had climbed earlier. He wore a black suit with a red tie, and as he approached, I could see that there wasn't a single mud stain on his perfectly shined dress shoes. His pant legs were uncrumpled and clean, and needless to say, he did not give the impression of a hiker. It was hard to tell how old he was. He looked older, but his skin did not show a single wrinkle. It's hard to describe, but somehow, the man managed to make me feel both unnerved and extremely repelled at the mere sight of him. May I join you? He asked in the same monotone voice, and without waiting for a reply, he sat down on the ground right next to me. What are you doing here? I stammered. Oh, I expected something like, who are you? But okay, fair enough. The hint of a smile grazed his thin lips, and as he gave me a small wink, I simply want to participate in your game. Truth or dare amongst friends is always interesting. Don't worry, I won't stay the night, he chuckled. By the way, that's a nice tent you got there. Thanks, Dylan offered. The stranger smiled once again. Now, why don't you go on? Whose turn was it? Dylan, right? Well then, go ahead. Dylan just stared at the man in utter confusion. I bit my lip. How had he known his name? Can't come up with something? I'll help you out. The stranger leaned back and looked up at the stars twinkling through the treetops before turning to face my fiancé. Jack, truth or dare? Listen, I don't know who you are, but I would rather you leave, Jack said in a low, cold voice as he pulled me in a little closer. Closing my fingers around his, I could feel them trembling. He did a good job masking his fear. The stranger chuckled and shook his head. Oh, come on now, Jackie. There's no need to be so rude. I just want to have a little fun with you guys. Playing a game won't hurt, will it? Side glancing at Jack's arm around my shoulders, he added, And I'm not going to steal your girl either. Relax. So, truth or dare? Jack scowled at him. Truth, he replied under his breath. Did Clover ever find out about the pictures? The man asked without even a hint of hesitation. Jack instantly turned pale and his hand slowly slid off my shoulder. I looked at him in confusion. He gave no answer, just stared at the strange man, a mixture of incredulousness and shock in his face. What pictures? He uttered. The newcomer laughed. No good one, Jack. But jokes aside, I guess that means you never told her. My fiancé didn't respond. Figured as much. It's probably better that way. The stranger continued. I doubt Sweet Clover would be quite as fond of you if she knew. By the way, congratulations and my best wishes for the two of you. I mean it. Then again, I kind of think that people who have decided to spend their life together should not have any secrets the other one doesn't know about. Don't you agree, Clover? Darling. He smirked at me and winked once again. That's enough. Screw off, Jack suddenly yelled at the man. His face had gone from pale to red. I shrunk back. I had never heard him scream before. The stranger, however, rolled his eyes and remained seated. Oh, Jack. It would have been better if you had just told her. She would have gladly forgiven you. You were still a pubescent, dumb boy after all. But now that you've kept it a secret from her for all these years, it makes you look horrible, you know. Like a pervert. A stalker, even. Also, I wouldn't have to do it. Shut up, Jack hissed through clenched teeth, but it almost sounded pleading, desperate. The year is 2010 and both Clover and Jack are 15, the man began, his voice like that of a history teacher. Jack had never gotten over the crush he developed on her in his early teens, and while Clover couldn't be less interested, he is pining for her on a daily basis. Now, 15-year-old Jack's most prized possession is a camera which he starts using to at least pretend he is close to his childhood sweetheart. He sneaks up to her house at night and climbs onto the balcony. From there, he has a nice view of Clover's room, and as he soon finds out, an even nicer spot to take pictures of her body when she's asleep or changing clothing. As time progresses, he grows disgusted by his own actions and stops taking these lewd photos. However, he apparently can't bring himself to destroy them. The camera still exists, and so do the photos. he never dares to look at them again after that. So, if I'm not mistaken, they're still under that same loose floorboard in his former room in his childhood home. I had listened to the story in horror. It was only when the man had stopped talking that I dared to look over at my fiancée. Jack was frozen. He had slumped over and was staring at the ever-flickering campfire with glazed eyes. Upon noticing my gaze, he turned away, avoiding to look me in the eyes. I swallowed the queasy feeling the tale had stirred in me, and asked in as gentle a voice that I could muster, "Is it true, what he says?" Jack nodded ever so slightly, and I could hear him mumble quiet words of apology. I scooched a little closer to him. "Baby, it's fine, you hear me? That was 9 years ago. It's not like you can change what happened now, and I still want to marry you. You were a kid, and to be honest, I think there are worse things a horny teenager could do. But I want you to go back to your parents' place and get rid of those pictures. We won't even have to talk about it ever again, okay?" He slowly raised his head to look up at me. "Really? You're actually letting me get away with this?" "I'll be honest, it does kind of hurt that you never told me, but I don't know. I'm crazy about you. Maybe I should be more upset, but I love you. Once we're married, we'll be facing a whole new caliber of problems, and I'm just grateful to have you here with me." "That's so sweet. Twisted, but sweet." The strange man's voice threw us out of our conversation, and back into the reality of sitting in the middle of the woods with a person that we had never met before. "See that, Dylan? That's commitment. Something you'll never quite understand." Dylan looked puzzled, but as the realization dawned on him, his heart dropped. I could see it in his eyes. The man knew something about him as well. "Dear Dylan has rambled on and on to all of you about how he wants to make his current girlfriend Jill his bride, and I admit, he is quite motivated. He even bought a ring already, but for some reason he just can't bring himself to ask. Now, you'd better ignore all that crap he's been telling you about waiting for the perfect moment. The truth is much less adorable, isn't it, Dylan?" The year is 2017. Dylan and Jill, or Jillian as I like to call them, had been dating for 3 years at that point. Jill is very much in love with her partner, but on his side, that feeling has started to wear off. At a party of one of his other friends Jill hasn't been invited to, he meets Rebecca. Rebecca tells him that she's 18. They hit it off right away, and Dylan is quite smitten by her. In his state of drunkenness, he doesn't even think twice about it, and the two of them excuse themselves from the party. When Dylan wakes up the next morning, he finds himself next to a younger-looking girl than he remembers. Who knows if she was even of age? She could have lied to him. The guilt hits him immediately, and he flees from the scene to confess his wrongdoings to his girlfriend. Now, Jill is quite appalled by his actions, but having about the self-esteem of a face cloth and still being quite fond of Dylan, she decides not to break up with him. Ever since then, their relationship has been slowly deteriorating. Dylan, however, has realized that he does have strong feelings for Jill, and he doesn't want to lose her. He starts toying with the idea of marriage. Surely, this would rescue the rotting corpse he calls a relationship, but would Jill say yes to him after that? The question plagues him, and to this day, he remains uncertain. The stranger let out a sigh and smiled over at Dylan with a look of pity. "But he never told you that, did he now? It's crazy how much you people don't know about one another, and yet you still call each other friends. Best friends, even. I don't know if that's admirable or sad." "Who are you?" I heard myself say. The words had just suddenly burst out of me. The man in the suit turned to face me. He looked surprised. "Oh, me. I'm flattered, dear. I thought out of all the new things you will learn tonight, I would be the least interesting. But by now you probably already know who I am. Are you the devil?" I couldn't believe I had actually said it. It sounded so insane, so surreal, but it felt correct. Upon mouthing my response, a slight frown crossed his face. "I hate it when they call me that," he uttered. He leaned back and stared up at the sky again. "No, I'm no devil by any means, but you're not wrong either. I go by many names, none of which describe me correctly. My favorite, though, the most accurate one, is Father of Lies. I'm not the guy who welcomes you into hell when you die. There isn't even anything like that. When you die, it's just over. The brain stops working. That's all. I see myself as more of an independent mind. I'm independent in a lot of aspects. Also, as you might have noticed already, I know a lot. Clover, why do you think I'm doing this? Coming up to your little group and telling you about all the mistakes you ever made. Because you get off on it, I suggested truthfully. Father of Lies smiled. As a matter of fact, I do. But I'll admit, my way of working is usually a bit different. Lovers arguing, children crying, nations fighting. That's me. That kind of stuff is always me. But once in a blue moon, when the weather's nice and the moon is up, I tend to feel a little more outgoing. Tonight's one of these occasions. I see. I felt myself suddenly becoming strangely calm. Are you going to tell some humiliating story about me now too? What? No. Let's be honest with ourselves here. No one here could care less about your little secrets. It's scandals I'm interested in. Not stuff like you getting up at night to watch these cheesy soap operas you always rant about. Or the fact that you jog over to the donut shop. You're nice, but you're boring. No offense. None taken, I murmured, confused and relieved at the same time. My hand instinctively reached up to scratch a certain spot in the back of my neck. I had bigger secrets than that, and he knew that. I was rather grateful that they would remain untold, though. Now, let's get to the real prize, shall we? Emily. Father of Lies turned to face my friend who was cowering next to Dylan, a deep scowl on her face. I was taken aback. I had never seen her look like that at anyone, ever. Emily was always so laid back. I would have expected her to be scared, but there was nothing but hatred in her gaze. Emily has told all of you about her husband, hasn't she? Well, the interesting thing is that the poor guy doesn't exist. Father of Lies began with a smug grin on his face. He's lying, Emily hissed. I'm not. But I admit I'm rather thrilled about this story. It's easily the most interesting out of these three. It's in early 2019, and our dear Emily had been seeing a gentleman named Marcus for quite a while now. The feelings that she has towards him, she describes them as love. Any sane person, however, would call it obsession. Marcus and Emily are in an official relationship, but for Emily, it isn't enough. She doesn't trust Marcus, or rather, she doesn't trust the women that interact with him. In Emily's mind, Marcus is hers and hers alone, and every single conversation he has with another female, in fact, even a simple hello, is enough to start the crazy train going. Marcus grows increasingly helpless against his girlfriend's psychological abuse. In the beginning, he used to find it cute when she got jealous, but by now, she's starting to scare him. he decides it would be best to break things off with her. Too bad that he makes that decision the very same day Emily decides she's going to propose to him. When he sits her down in their shared apartment and tells her that they need to talk, she thinks that they had the same idea. So when he tells her that it would be best if they would part ways, she goes into a frenzy. She runs into the kitchen, grabs a knife, and proceeds to stab Marcus 8 times in the chest. But poor Emily had already become so deranged that this isn't where she stops. She puts on the ring that she bought for him and calls one of her best friends, our darling Clover here, to tell her that she and Marcus were now engaged. Ever since then, Emily has pretended to have a husband. The story about the Vegas wedding, fake. All the funny and cute tales she told you about their life together, made up. Every last one of them. The fact that the 3 of you live so far apart from her has most certainly helped her hide it. Otherwise, you might have gotten wind of the police search after the poor guy. They never found him. Incompetent dimwits. And no, Marcus suddenly developing an aversion to social media is of course not the reason that he doesn't appear in any of her pictures anymore. To this day, he's peacefully rotting away in her freezer. By the time that he had ended his tale, we were staring at Emily in utter horror. I couldn't believe it. So this was the person that I had grown up with. A murderer. How had she even managed to set up such an elaborate facade? How had she been able to deceive us like that? When she had told me about her engagement over the phone, I had been so happy for her. I had met Marcus just once before, but I had never really had the desire to pursue a friendship with him. All the things she said, I had simply believed them. Emily slowly rose to her feet. She looked around at us and then, suddenly, she lunged at the father of lies. I let out a shriek and I could hear Jack gasp loudly. But Emily didn't get very far. She halted mid-motion, frozen with her arms outstretched and her hands grabbing at nothing. Father of lies smirked. "That was really uncalled for," he said softly. He shot me a quick glance and his smile grew even wider. "May Emily, truth or dare?" Emily opened her mouth to reply, but it was his voice that spoke. "Dare." I could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't doing this. As I looked over at Father of Lies, his gaze seemed to be already expecting me, and we locked eyes for a brief moment. I mouthed a silent plea, begging for my former friend's life, but he merely shook his head. When he spoke up again, his voice was as cold as ice. "I dare you to plunge that stupid head of yours into the campfire." I will not describe the scene that followed. The sight of Emily's flesh melting off her skull is not one I would like to relive. Jack and Dylan's screams of horror and the crackling of the fire mixed with the muffled cries of Emily all seemed to be in the far distance. I didn't scream. I turned my head to look at Father of Lies. For some reason, I felt empty, void. I simply stared at him and the tiny smile that had formed on his thin lips. When Emily ceased to move, Jack and Dylan just sat and stared at her dead body. They seemed to be in a state of shock. Registering this, I made a mental note to suggest therapy to my fiancée on our way home. When Father of Lies got up, so did I. "Jack," he asked. "Jack, do you mind if I borrow your wife-to-be for a second?" "Jack?" No reply. "Huh," he murmured. "I guess he can't hear us." He grinned at me. "Was that really necessary?" I inquired. "I'm afraid so. Wouldn't you have done the same? Look, I didn't want to ruin your camping trip, but I was around and saw you sit there and, I'm really sorry. But she had that coming. Let's be honest here. Have you ever seen anything so disrespectful? And besides, she was a murderer. He straightened his suit. I hate it when they're disrespectful. I just stared at him, arms crossed in front of my chest. You didn't recognize me at first, did you? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Sorry, but you changed your looks. You always do. How can you expect me to just spot you immediately? I thought you were one of your brothers. I caught on when you told me about that independent stuff, though. It's fine. He took a few steps towards me and motioned for me to turn around. I obeyed, and he closed his hand around my long hair and lifted it up. He let his fingers graze these spots in the back of my neck, the spot that held his mark. There it is, he muttered. Nice and clear. He rubbed over it with his thumb. You really thought I would tell them about the deal for a second back there, didn't you? He chuckled. Remember the promise I gave you? I nodded. Good. Now remember the promise you gave me. I nodded once again. Don't worry. My heart belongs to him, but my soul will always be yours.